To understand Marius, you have to understand what he saw. He didn't rise in a strong Rome. He rose in a decaying one. Rome, by the late 2nd century BCE, was an empire in everything but name. Its legions spanned from Spain to Syria, from the windswept forests of Gaul to the deserts of Numidia. The Senate claimed to lead, but in truth, it followed the tides of ambition, money, and blood. To the outside world, Rome looked invincible, but inside, the Republic was unraveling. At its core was a system built for a city-state, not an empire. The Roman Republic had grown too big for its own values. Its institutions, designed for a small citizen body, couldn't contain the ambitions of generals or the desperation of the masses. And that desperation was everywhere. Rome's conquests had flooded it with wealth, but wealth concentrated in the hands of the few. Vast estates called latifundia replaced family farms, worked by slaves captured in war. Meanwhile, small landowners, the very backbone of the Republic and its legions, were swallowed by debt and eviction. They poured into the city by the thousands. Jobless, landless, angry, the Roman mob. The Senate saw these men as a nuisance, a political tool to be bribed with grain, distracted with gladiators. But Marius saw an army. He saw men hardened by failure, men with no illusions, men who had been forgotten by the system and were ready to give everything to someone who finally saw them. Yet the military remained chained to old ideals. According to Roman law, only landowners could serve in the legions. Only those with property were considered to have a true stake in the Republic. This made sense when Rome was a patchwork of citizen farmers defending their land. But now, with conquests overseas and growing class divisions, the rule was out of date. And worse, it left the Republic exposed. Rome needed soldiers, but it had turned away the very men most willing to fight. It was a nation clinging to pride while bleeding manpower. Meanwhile, foreign wars piled up. In Numidia, King Jugurtha mocked Roman authority. In Gaul, Germanic tribes tested Rome's northern borders. The Senate bickered. Generals failed. Veterans returned home to nothing, and the mob grew restless. In this chaos, Rome cried out for someone to fix the broken machine. That man would be Marius. He was not born into power. He had no famous lineage, no noble ancestors, but he had something far more potent: ambition sharpened by exclusion. Marius came from Arpinum, a provincial town looked down upon by the Roman elite. He joined the army young, distinguished himself in battle, and climbed the ranks not through favor, but through fury. His service record was undeniable, his discipline unmatched, his will unbreakable, and the people saw it. In 107 BCE, with the Juguthine War dragging into embarrassment, the people broke precedent and elected Marius consul. It was a rebellion, cloaked in legality. Rome had chosen a soldier over a statesman, a fighter over a diplomat, and in doing so, the Republic unknowingly gave Marius its future. Marius knew that to win abroad, he needed to change the rules at home. He did something radical. He opened the legions to the landless. Anyone, regardless of wealth, could now serve. To the Senate, it was blasphemy. To the people, it was salvation. Thousands enlisted, not for Rome, for the man who gave them a sword. This was the beginning of a new kind of army. Not citizen soldiers fighting for country, but professional warriors bound by loyalty to a general. And behind that shift was a psychological truth. These men had no homes to defend, no farms to return to. The Republic had abandoned them. But Marius offered identity. He offered structure, brotherhood, purpose, and more than anything, he offered land, a future, a promise. He wasn't just giving them armor, he was giving them belonging. Thus, the foundations were laid, not just for a military revolution, but for a psychological one. Rome had built its legions on land, law, and lineage. Marius rebuilt them on hunger, faith, and fury. And from that forge emerged the most loyal army the Republic had ever seen. But loyalty is a double-edged sword, and Marius had just sharpened it. Who was Gaius Marius, really? To the patricians, he was a threat. an outsider who refused to stay in his place. To the people, he was a symbol, proof that Rome's rigid hierarchy could be shattered by will alone. He wasn't just a soldier, he was a statement. Marius came from nothing, and in Rome, that meant everything. Born in Arpinum, a town miles away from a political center, both geographically and culturally, Marius carried the stain of low birth. He wasn't a noble. He wasn't connected. He was, as they called him, a novice homo, a new man. But new blood carries a different kind of hunger. Marius joined the military not out of tradition, but necessity, and he stayed not for prestige, but for transformation. As he rose through the ranks, Marius saw firsthand what made Rome strong and what made it fragile. He served under Scipio Aemilianus, who led the final siege of Carthage. He fought in Spain, Numidia, and across the fractured edges of the empire. And he studied not just how men fought, but why they fought. He watched senators give orders from marble villas while soldiers bled for nothing. He watched Rome forget the men who defended it, and he swore he would never do the same. When Marius was elected consul in 107 BCE, it wasn't just a personal victory, it was a cultural rupture. A man with no noble ancestors had taken Rome's highest office. It was like tearing open the sky. His enemies called it vulgar, dangerous, a break from the sacred traditions. But Marius didn't care for sacred. He cared for results. And Rome was failing. The war in Numidia was dragging on. Corruption was choking leadership. Veterans returned broken and forgotten. So Marius did what no one expected. He rewrote the rules. He opened the army to the poor, equipped them with state-funded weapons, promised them land after service. He turned desperation into devotion. And his new soldiers believed. They didn't fight for the Senate. They didn't fight for abstract ideals. They fought for Marius, because he saw them. And when someone truly sees you, you don't forget it. Rome had long believed its strength came from its traditions. But Marius proved that strength could come from the broken. He took the cast-offs of the Republic, the unemployed, the homeless, the shamed, and gave them a banner to fight under. And in doing so, he built something terrifying, an army not of citizens, but of disciples. Rome had found its most loyal soldiers, but they weren't loyal to Rome. They were loyal to Marius, and history would never be the same. Loyalty is often mistaken for emotion, but in truth, it's structure, a framework of need, identity, memory, and fear. Gaius Marius understood this instinctively, not because he studied psychology, because he lived it. He didn't ask his soldiers for allegiance to abstract ideals. He offered them something far more potent, a personal mythology. They weren't just Roman legionaries, they were his men. The Marian army wasn't just a force, it was a family formed under fire. Uniformed, trained, hardened. But what made it terrifying wasn't their armor. It was their clarity. They had no competing loyalties, no senatorial interference. Their future, land, retirement, honor, depended on one man, Marius. And that psychological dependency created something Rome had never seen, a military cult of personality. But Marius didn't build it with speeches. He built it with systems. He changed everything. Before him, Roman soldiers brought their own gear. Richer citizens had better equipment. Poorer ones went without. Marius made the state supply weapons and armor to everyone. The result? Uniformity, identity, equality. The men no longer fought as themselves. They fought as a unit. He didn't stop there. He reorganized legions into smaller, more efficient cohorts. He trained them relentlessly, introduced discipline, merit. Gone were the days of inherited rank. Under Marius, a man could rise by sheer ability. To those cast out by the Republic, that was revolutionary. And it created devotion not just to the idea of Rome, but to the man who finally saw their worth. But the real genius of Marius wasn't military. It was psychological. He understood that humans crave meaning, and in the chaos of collapsing institutions, they will cling to anyone who gives it to them. Marius gave his soldiers more than a job. He gave them a myth. He painted their suffering as sacrifice, their struggle as glory. Their loyalty is destiny. Each soldier believed they were part of something eternal, something greater, and that illusion made them invincible. They marched longer, fought harder, endured pain that would shatter ordinary men, not for the Senate, for the man who told them they mattered. Loyalty like that is not born. It's forged in shared trauma, in structured belief, in the silence after victory, when the only thing holding you together is the voice of your general. Marius became more than a commander. He became an identity. But gratitude has a cost, because a man who commands that kind of loyalty no longer serves the Republic. He becomes its rival. And as Marius' fame grew, so did the fear. In the Senate halls, they whispered of dictatorship, of ambition unchecked. And yet they needed him. The Germanic threat in the north was real. The Cimbri and Teutons had crushed Roman legions. Rome was desperate once again. And once again, it turned to Marius. Over the next several years, Marius would be elected consul 6 times. 6, in a republic that once prized annual rotation and power sharing. This was unthinkable. But Rome was no longer a republic. Not in spirit. It was a battlefield where fear demanded strength, and strength met Marius. And so the loyalty deepened. His army defeated the Teutons at Aquae Sexti, then the Cimbri at Vercelli. They weren't just victories. They were redemptions. Proof that the Senate's caution was weakness. That Marius' vision was the only path forward. Rome hailed him as the 3rd founder of the city. The poor worshipped him. The elite feared him. Because behind every victory was an army that no longer fought for the Republic. It fought for its maker. And the maker was Marius. The psychology of loyalty is simple. People follow who they believe will lead them out of the storm. But when the storm is over and that leader remains, that loyalty becomes something else. A quiet, unseen chain. A bond that no Senate could ever control. And with every legion that marched under his name, Marius was tightening the chain around the throat of the Republic. What binds men more tightly than law? More deeply than patriotism? Shared suffering. The kind of suffering that reconfigures the mind. And Marius, intentionally or not, created the perfect conditions for it. His legions were not just soldiers. They were trauma survivors. Marching through frozen rivers and scorching deserts, sleeping in armor, digging trenches, watching comrades die in their arms. They endured it all together. And that endurance rewired them. In psychological terms, it created trauma bonding. A process where extreme emotional experiences form near unbreakable attachments between people. In Marius's ranks, this wasn't accidental. It was strategic. He demanded more than obedience. He demanded transformation. From peasant to legionary. From forgotten to feared. And transformation requires pain. Marius put his men through a crucible. Grueling training. Long campaigns. Brutal standards. And in doing so, he made them dependent. Not on Rome, but on each other. The Republic never offered that kind of intimacy. The Senate gave laws. Marius gave identity. He didn't treat them like numbers. He called them his mules. Yes, but not with disdain. With admiration. Because they carried Rome on their backs. And they knew it. They knew, too, that without each other, they were nothing. Individually, they were poor, landless, disposable. Together, they were the most disciplined, experienced, and emotionally fused military force in Roman history. That brotherhood was thicker than law. It wasn't just loyalty to Marius anymore. It was loyalty to each other. They developed a code not written in policy, but in action. You don't abandon your brother. You don't question the man who gave you meaning. You don't retreat unless he says so. It was a culture, a tribal mind, a hive of trauma-shaped warriors, fused by necessity and ritual. The rituals mattered. The way they marched, the way they buried their dead, the way they shared spoils. Every act repeated in unison deepened the collective identity. Modern psychology calls this identity fusion, a phenomenon where personal and group identity become indistinguishable. The self dissolves, and what remains is allegiance. Rome didn't see it happening. The The Senate still imagined soldiers as tools, as instruments of the state. But tools don't cry over fallen brothers. Tools don't follow a man across a continent. Tools don't kill for memory. Marius's army was no tool. It was a living organism, and that made it powerful and dangerous. Why does this matter? Because once men have been shaped in this way, once they've tasted identity and purpose, they cannot return to silence. You cannot send them back to nothing, to forgotten slums, to neglected farms, to being invisible again. They will not accept it, and they will follow whoever offers them a future. Marius offered them a ladder, climbed through blood, through sacrifice, through brotherhood, and in return land, honor, belonging. But the Senate, they offered them bureaucracy, delay, debate, suspicion, and slowly, the line between soldier and citizen blurred. The army was no longer the Republic's. It was a mirror held up to its failure. And this is the danger of loyalty born in pain. It creates men who are loyal, not because of what is, but because of what they endured. Their loyalty is not rational. It is sacred, and sacred things do not bend. They break. Rome had created a new species of soldier, forged by Marius, hardened by abandonment, bound by pain, and they would not be undone by politics, because no senator, no consul, no republic could ever take from them what trauma had made unshakable: brotherhood. And that brotherhood would soon be tested in a war not against foreign invaders, but against Rome itself. The most dangerous army is not the one marching on your border. It's the one standing within your gates, staring into your soul. And by the time the Senate realized what Marius had created, it was already too late. The Republic was cracking, not from barbarians, but from imbalance, from the rot of a system that excluded its own protectors. The veterans returned from victory not to praise, but to poverty. Their promised lands, tied up in legislation. Their loyalty, questioned. And in the silence of Rome's indifference, resentment grew. Marius watched this unfold. He had won wars, saved cities, built an army that could outlast empires. And yet, he was treated as a threat. The Senate feared his influence, his popularity, his connection to the people. So they turned to a younger man, Lucius Cornelius Sulla, a patrician, a former subordinate of Marius, and a man who understood precisely what power looked like, because he had seen Marius wield it. In 88 BCE, war loomed in the east. A new enemy, Mithridates of Pontus. Sulla was given command of the campaign. Marius protested. He argued he was more experienced, more capable, more deserving, but the Senate refused. So Marius did something unthinkable. He used the loyalty of the plebeian assembly and had the command reassigned to himself. In that moment, the Republic cracked wide open. It was no longer an abstract battle of laws. It was a civil war. For the first time in Roman history, a general marched on Rome. It wasn't Marius. It was Sulla. He entered the city with legions behind him, swords drawn, not for foreign conquest, but domestic correction. Marius fled, barely escaping death. Rome itself, had been conquered by its own. But death has many stages, and the Republic, like a wounded animal, still crawled. After Sulla left for the east, Marius returned, older now, broken perhaps, but not beaten. He raised his own army, and took Rome again. What followed was not glory. It was revenge, a purge of enemies, executions, terror. The city trembled beneath the weight of two titans who had both once served it, and now threatened to tear it in half. This was not what Marius had envisioned. He didn't set out to destroy the Republic. He wanted to make it stronger, by opening it to those who bled for it. But in giving the army identity, he had given them independence. And once the sword becomes sovereign, there is no going back. The psychological cost was irreversible. The Senate no longer had the monopoly on loyalty. That belonged to commanders, to men who could give soldiers meaning, memory, reward. Marius had changed the rules, but it was Sulla who weaponized them. And when he returned from the east, It would be Marius's name that was wiped from temples, his reforms reversed, his allies slaughtered, and the Republic, now gasping for air, would stumble forward into darkness. But this is not just history. This is psychology. Because what happened in Rome happens in all human systems. When you deny people purpose, they seek it in shadows. When you ignore their suffering, they bond in trauma. And when you give one man the power to heal them, you've already chosen your next god. History remembers Marius as a military innovator, a 6-time consul, the man who reformed Rome's army. But he was something deeper, a mirror held up to a dying system. He revealed the truth no senator dared to speak. That power doesn't live in law, it lives in loyalty. And once loyalty migrates from institution to individual, from republic to man, the transformation is permanent. Marius didn't destroy the republic. He exposed that it was already collapsing under the weight of inequality, arrogance, and institutional decay. He gave the voiceless a voice, but in doing so, he gave them a sword. And once drawn, that sword could never return to its sheath. Look around today, and the pattern is familiar. Wherever systems neglect those who serve them, new loyalties emerge. In movements, in ideologies, in men who promise what the system won't. And like Marius, they don't rise by ambition alone. They rise because something older has already fallen. So if you seek to understand the future, study Marius, not as a hero, not as a villain, but as a warning, because the most devout army in history wasn't just loyal, it was forsaken, and all they ever wanted was to be remembered.